Hi, my dark diamond. You know you'll never have a chance with me, right? You're nothing but a starving, hopeless loser.
The janitor, humiliated by an arrogant employee, comes back years later as the company's co-founder. The third-floor men's bathroom at the Meridian Commercial Center on Michigan Avenue in Chicago had a drain leak in the corner sink that had been sitting in Doroteo Pinheiro's maintenance log for 3 weeks. Not because he'd forgotten about it, because the part had been ordered through facilities. Facilities had passed it to Central Supply. Central Supply had added it to a purchase order, and that order had been sitting at pending approval ever since the responsible manager left for vacation and the substitute took over the desk without taking over the inbox. Dorotheo knew that road. He'd been inside buildings for 42 years, from doorman to custodian, from custodian to head building engineer of an 18-story commercial tower on Michigan Avenue, where 100 companies had offices and where each company had employees who sometimes noticed the leaking drain and sometimes didn't, and who, when they did notice it, typically reacted with the expression of someone who had found a problem that was clearly someone else's responsibility. He was 61 that October. He'd been born in rural Texas, outside Laredo, and had moved to Chicago at 19 with a duffel bag and his cousin's address on a post-it note. The cousin had been right. The city had work for anyone willing to work. The city had taken about 2 years to stop feeling enormous and another 3 to start feeling like home. Then he stayed. He'd built a life of hallways, corridors, and utility rooms over 4 decades. And he'd been building in parallel over the last 4 years something that no one in the building knew he was building. Claudia Mercer was 32, operations manager at Vortex Consulting, and had arrived at the Meridian 4 months earlier, transferred from the New York office with a promotion. She was sharp, she was organized. She had the efficiency of someone who had learned early that results are what matter, and that the path between where you are and the result should have as few obstacles as possible. On that Monday morning in October, she arrived at her floor at 8:12. Went to the bathroom, noticed the dripping drain, came back out, and spotted Dorotheo with his maintenance cart 10 meters away. "Hey," Dorotheo turned. "Good morning." "There's a leak in the third-floor bathroom." "I know, ma'am." "The part has been in the purchasing pipeline since—" "How long?" "3 weeks. As soon as it comes in, I'll have it fixed in. 3 weeks is unacceptable." She said it with the tone that is simultaneously an evaluation and an accusation. "I understand. Unfortunately, the part depends on an approval process that I'm not interested in who depends on whom. This is your job. I manage what's within my reach. The purchase order isn't 3 memos in 3 weeks and the drain is still leaking." Claudia looked at the cart, at the uniform, at Dorotheo with the expression of someone looking at an obstacle instead of a person. "I'll be speaking with building management about the service level on this floor." She walked away. Dorotheo kept his hand on the cart for a moment. Then he turned and went back to work. The conversation with management happened that afternoon. Susan, the building's property manager, had listened, explained the procurement process, and apologized for the timeline. Claudia said she expected a prompt resolution. She left. Susan found Dorotheo. "Claudia from Vortex filed a complaint." "I know. Was she rough with you?" "She was in a hurry," Dorotheo said. Susan sat with that for a second. "If you need backup, you know where to find me." "Thank you, Susan." The part arrived Wednesday. The drain was fixed Thursday morning. Dorotheo logged the resolution in his maintenance journal, not just the fix, but the full timeline, date of diagnosis, date of request, date of part arrival, date of resolution. 22 days from start to finish. He wrote down 22 days. He sat with that number. It was the kind of thing that had stayed with him for 42 years. Not irritation at the delay, but the question the delay raised. What caused those 22 days? Was it possible to anticipate the need for the part before the drain started leaking? That question had been the beginning of everything. What no one at the Meridian knew was that Dorotheo had spent the last 4 years developing on his own time a predictive maintenance system for commercial buildings. It had started as a more detailed journal than the union's standard form. The form had fields for date, problem, resolution, material used. Dorotheo's journal had all of that and more, what he had observed before the problem appeared. The elevator's faint grinding a week before it needed an adjustment. The slight dampness on the wall 3 weeks before it became a visible water stain. The growing wobble in the 10th floor faucet before it started dripping. 42 years of patterns. He'd turned the journal into a spreadsheet, then into a more structured database. With help from his nephew Marcus, 23 years old, a junior software developer in Austin who had spent several Saturday afternoons on the phone with his uncle, helping turn what was in Dorotheo's head into something that worked on a screen. Marcus had been impressed, not with the format, but with the content. "Uncle, what you have here is an anomaly detection algorithm. You're identifying deviation from expected behavior before the deviation becomes a failure. Didn't know it had a name," Dorotheo said. "It does, and there are companies that pay a lot of money to have this in industrial software. I have mine in a notebook, and now we're going to put it in a system that actually works." It had taken them 2 years to build. In the 2 years that followed, Dorotheo field-tested the system at the Meridian. Unanticipated failures dropped to a third of the historical baseline. Susan had noticed the improvement. She'd attributed it to more careful maintenance. That was exactly what it was. It was also far more specific than that phrase implied. In March of the following year, Susan had asked Dorotheo to explain how he was running maintenance. A manager from another building in the same ownership group had asked about the reduction in failures, and she'd said she'd check. Dorotheo opened his laptop. Susan sat with that image, head building engineer with a laptop in his own bag, for a moment that lasted longer than it should take to process. He showed her the database, the categories, the entry fields, the automatically generated reports. He explained the logic. You log what you observe before the failure. The system calculates the likely maintenance window. The part order goes in ahead of time, instead of after the problem has already settled in. Susan was quiet for longer than it would take just to absorb what she was seeing. "You built this." "Me and Marcus. He built the technical side. I built the content." "How long ago?" 4 years of development, 2 years in use here. "And you never mentioned it." "You never asked," said without any irony. It was just a fact. Nobody had asked. "Can I show this to Richard?" Susan said. Richard was the CEO of Meridian Property Group, which managed 12 commercial buildings across Chicago. "Go ahead." Richard Callahan had built the group over 20 years and had developed a capacity he described as the only real talent he'd brought to the business, recognizing what was working, asking why it was working, and replicating what he found. He listened to Dorotheo for 40 minutes. He asked technical questions about categorization, about the calculation of maintenance windows, about adaptation for building profiles different from the Meridian. Dorotheo answered everyone with the precision of someone who had thought about those exact questions over 4 years, not because he'd anticipated that meeting, but because they were the natural questions of someone building something that needed to work. At the end, Richard was quiet for a moment. "There are 12 buildings in the group. If it works at the Meridian, the way Susan is telling me, it works at the other 11. Dorotheo didn't say anything. "What do you need to scale this to 12 buildings?" It was the question that Dorotheo had not expected would be a question. He sat with it for a moment. "Someone with more technical capacity than my nephew," he said, "and a training process for the engineers in the other buildings. The system only works if the person doing the logging knows what they're looking for. The data depends on the observer. And would you be able to lead that training? I've been doing it for myself for 40 years. Richard sat with that. "What if we talked about this differently?" That different conversation took 4 months. There were intellectual property questions, equity negotiations, the process of formalizing something that until then existed only on Dorotheo's laptop and Saturday afternoons with Marcus. Marcus had come to Chicago in the third month, first time on a plane, ticket paid by the group, and had worked intensively for 2 weeks to build the scalable version of the system. In the fifth month, there was a contract. Dorotheo signed a co-founder and chief operations consultant agreement for Predictor-Maint, a company within the Meridian Property Group created to license the system to buildings outside the group. In a conference room with a view of Michigan Avenue, with Richard on one side of the table and the attorney on the other, he looked at his own signature for a moment. He thought about Laredo. He thought about 19 years old and the duffel bag and the post-it with his cousin's address. He thought about 42 years of hallways, corridors and utility rooms, and he thought about the maintenance journal, and about how the journal had become the database, and the database had become the system, and the system had become that signature in that room. It was a long road. It was the only road there was. Claudia Mercer heard about Predictor-Maint through an internal memo from building management announcing the implementation of a predictive maintenance system developed in partnership with head building engineer Dorotheo Pinheiro, co-founder of Predictor-Maint. She read it twice. She was quiet for a moment in the Vortex consulting office on the third floor. She thought about that Monday morning in October when she had said, 3 weeks is unacceptable, with the tone she'd used. She thought about, I'm not interested in who depends on whom, and this is your job. She sat with it longer than was comfortable. The following week, she ran into Dorotheo in the hallway. Dorotheo? He stopped. Good morning? I read about the system. Congratulations. Thank you. A beat. I was rude to you that day. Dorotheo paused. You were in a hurry, he said. I was, but I was rude anyway. Said with the directness of someone who had decided to say it, not as a concession, but as an acknowledgement. It wasn't fair. Dorotheo was quiet for a moment. It's in the past, he said, not as generous absolution, as a fact. Something that had happened and that time had placed where things that have happened go. For me, it's not completely past, said Claudia, but I wanted you to know that I know I was wrong. I know, said Dorotheo finally. And I appreciate you saying it. It had been a hallway conversation. It had been enough to be a complete conversation. Dorotheo Pinheiro had learned from his father back in Laredo a simple distinction he'd carried through all 42 years of work. The distinction was this: there is the work you do because someone is watching, and the work you do because the work needs to be done. His father had been a farm laborer, not the landowner, a worker on someone else's land, tended with the same care he would have given his own, because he'd learned that the quality of work doesn't depend on who owns the result, but on who the person doing the work is. Dorotheo had carried that into every door, every hallway, every maintenance log, into the system, into Predictor-Maint, and into the way he kept working at the Meridian after signing the co-founder contract, not as someone who had arrived somewhere and could stop, but as someone who had arrived at a point from which the work continued, just at a different scale. He kept doing his rounds, kept the journal, kept logging patterns, and when Susan had hired a new building engineer, Yvonne, 47 from Evanston, 20 years in residential buildings, and had told Dorotheo she'd hired someone like you because she'd arrived at the interview with a 100-page notebook and had said the pages were, "What buildings tell me before they ask for help." Dorotheo had gone to the Meridian one Tuesday afternoon and sat with Yvonne for 2 hours. He looked at her notebook. It was a different system, different categories, a color-coding scheme she had developed on her own. He sat with the color coding for a moment. This works as an urgency filter, he said. It does, said Yvonne. Red is immediate, orange is this week, yellow is this cycle, green is monitor. That's not in the system. No, no. He paused. It could be. He called Marcus that afternoon, described the color code system, sent a photo of the notebook. The following week, the update was available for all buildings. That's how good systems grow, not by the exclusive design of whoever started them, but by the contribution of whoever enters and brings what they developed on their own. What you know how to do with what you have is what you build. And what you build, if it's solid enough, stays. And it stays because it was always there, waiting for the moment when someone would ask. The question came at the right time. And what had always been there answered. If this story made you think, share it with someone who does work that seems invisible but is essential. Leave a comment. Have you ever found exceptional talent somewhere you didn't expect to find it? What happened when you recognized it? Predictor Maint had completed its first year with 23 buildings using the system, 12 from the original Meridian Property Group and 11 outside ones that had reached out after a commercial real estate trade publication described it as the first predictive building maintenance solution developed entirely from field knowledge, with no academic or corporate origin. Dorotheo read the article 3 times. He sat with the phrase "no academic origin" for a moment. It was true, and it was exactly what had worked. The system had started from 42 years of corridors, not theory, and because of that it had captured what theory frequently doesn't, the way problems announce themselves before they are problems, which is a language you learn by doing, and that doesn't exist in any manual. Marcus had hired 2 additional developers by month 8. He'd moved into a proper office in the West Loop with a conference room, and he'd insisted, from the first day in that new office, that there was a desk reserved for his uncle. Not because his uncle needed a fixed desk, but because there was something important about making sure the space where the system was born had room for the hand that had built its content. Dorotheo went to the office once a month. He'd sit down, open his laptop, review the reports from all the buildings, note what he found relevant. It was the same work as the journal. The scale had changed. The work was the same. In December of the second year, Dorotheo had gone back to Laredo for the first time in 15 years for his father's 80th birthday. He'd flown, the first time his father had ever seen his son step off a plane, and his father had stood at the regional airport entrance with that expression of a man who doesn't make ceremony of his feelings, but who was having feelings. On the afternoon of the second day, sitting on the porch of the house where Dorotheo had grown up, his father said, "You went to Chicago at 19 with an address on a piece of paper. Marcus's dad's address, my cousin. And you stayed." I stayed. There was the kind of silence that's comfortable, the silence between people who don't need words to fill the space. "How did the rest happen?" his father said. Dorotheo thought. "I learned to observe here," he said. He looked at the dry land around them. "You always knew what the soil needed before it asked. I learned the same thing in buildings." His father was quiet for longer than he had been before. "I didn't know I had taught that. You didn't teach it in words." "I learned by watching." It was a porch conversation on a hot December afternoon in South Texas. It was also the confirmation of something Dorotheo had known, but that became clearer said out loud. That what he had carried to Chicago at 19 in that duffel bag wasn't just clothes and his cousin's address on a post-it. He had also carried that simple distinction his father had demonstrated without naming, that there is the work you do because someone is watching, and the work you do because the work needs to be done, and that it's the second kind that builds the things that last. Marcus had told Dorotheo, on a Thursday afternoon at the West Loop office, that he'd received contact from a property management tech company in Atlanta interested in licensing the system for residential condo management, a different market from commercial, with different dynamics, but with the same core logic of observing before the problem appears. Dorotheo was quiet for a moment. "Residential is different," he said. "The failure patterns are different. The relationship with the resident is different from the relationship with a company." "I know. That's why I'm asking you before I respond. How much time do we have?" "A week." Dorotheo sat with it a moment longer. "Get me the contact. I want to talk to the building engineer they're using as their pilot." Marcus paused for a second. The engineer. The engineer. Not the IT manager. The building engineer. He's the one who's going to use the system. He's the one who'll know what works and what doesn't in that context. Marcus sent the contact. Dorotheo called that afternoon. He talked for 45 minutes with a 63-year-old building engineer who said in the 10th minute of the conversation that there was a specific problem in residential that they hadn't solved yet. Residents who reported issues late because they didn't want to bother the HOA board, and the problem grew bigger than it needed to because of it. Dorotheo sat with that for 2 days. He walked into the office on the following Wednesday with an idea, a simplified reporting field used by the resident on their phone that would feed the system without requiring the resident to know they were feeding a predictive maintenance system. Marcus listened, was quiet. "Uncle, that's a new feature. It's what you need to work in residential." You arrived at that from a 45-minute phone call with a building engineer. "He knew where to look," said Dorotheo. "I just knew what to do with what he showed me. That was how the system had grown, not from inside the office, not from a strategy meeting, but from a phone call between 2 building engineers who had spoken the same language of people who spend their days listening to what buildings have to say. That was the foundation the system had always had, and as long as that foundation stayed in view, the system would keep going. On the last day of the 2nd year of Predictor Maint, Marcus had printed the impact report and placed it on Dorotheo's desk at the West Loop office. The report showed 43 buildings, average reduction of 58% in unanticipated failures, estimated savings of $2.7 million in avoided emergency maintenance for the year. Dorotheo read the report, was quiet. "Why are you showing me this?" he finally said. "Because it's the result of what you built. It's the result of what the engineers in 43 buildings built, each in their own notebook. The system just organized it." Marcus sat with that. "Uncle, the system is what made this possible at scale, and the engineers are what made the system possible." A pause. "When you remember that in every decision you make about the system, it will keep working. When you forget, it will stop working." It had been the last conversation of the year. It had also been the most important one Marcus held on to, because the things that last for a reason, and the reason is rarely the technology or the strategy or the capital. The reason is the person who keeps walking the corridor with the notebook in hand, even after the contract was signed and the company was formed, and the conference room has a window facing the street. The reason is that the work continues, and whoever knows how to work keeps working. If this story made you think, share it with someone who does work that seems invisible but is essential. Leave a comment. Have you ever found exceptional talent somewhere you didn't expect it? What happened when you recognized it?